The rules were clear: evict anyone more than 45 days late on rent, or lose everything. But when Sarah McKinley saw the proud Gulf War veteran in her building quietly skipping meals just to get by, she broke those rules. What she didn't know was that her choice would set off a chain of events no landlord could expect. The lobby still smelled faintly of floor wax and old radiator heat, the same way it had when Sarah McKinley was a little girl, trailing behind her father as he made his evening rounds. The walls were a pale yellow, their paint cracked at the corners, and the marble tiles were worn smooth from decades of footsteps. Her father used to say this building was more than bricks and pipes. It was a promise to people who had nowhere else to go. Now, the promise felt heavier than she could carry. She tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear and studied the stack of papers in her hand. Bank statements, overdue notices, and a printed copy of the management contract she'd been forced to sign after the roof repairs nearly wiped out her savings. The ink on the agreement was barely 2 months old, but it already felt like a set of handcuffs. The property management company's latest email was blunt. Tenant Flynn Walker is 61 days delinquent. Evict immediately or face contractual penalties and possible legal action. Her stomach tightened. Through the lobby's front window, she spotted Flynn in the parking lot. The man was crouched beside a battered black and chrome motorcycle, his hands black with grease. His lean frame and weathered face looked older than his years, but there was a steadiness in the way he worked, deliberate, almost careful, as if each bolt and wire was a puzzle worth solving. Sarah knew he'd served in the Gulf War. She'd learned that much from the old mail addressed to Sergeant Flynn Walker that sometimes arrived in his box. But he didn't talk much about himself. She stepped outside, the warm summer air tinged with the sharp scent of motor oil. "Afternoon, Flynn," she said gently. He looked up, wiped his hands on a rag, and offered a polite nod. "Ms. McKinley." "Sarah," she corrected. "You're out here a lot lately." "Better than sittin' inside staring at the walls," he replied, his voice gravelly but calm. She glanced toward the grocery bag sitting beside him. A loaf of bread, a jar of peanut butter, and nothing else. "You eating enough?" He smirked faintly. "Don't worry about me." Then, after a pause, "Got a couple things to catch up on. I'll square it." Sarah wanted to believe him, but she'd seen the notices piling up under his door. 2 months behind. And now the management company breathing down her neck. Later that evening, she stopped by his unit under the pretense of delivering the new laundry room code. The door creaked open to reveal a small apartment that was neat but sparse. Flynn invited her in for a moment, and as he poured her a glass of water, she caught a glimpse of the open fridge behind him. A half-empty carton of milk, 2 eggs, and a lone jar of pickles sitting on an otherwise bare shelf. Her chest ached. At home that night, Sarah sat at the kitchen table, the contract spread out before her. Her son, Ronnie, shuffled in wearing his usual uniform of basketball shorts and a faded hoodie. 16, restless, and never far from his phone. "You're working late again?" he asked, pouring himself a glass of soda. "Something like that," she murmured, not wanting to dump her worries on him. "What's wrong?" he pressed. She hesitated. "It's about one of the tenants. He's having a hard time." Ronnie shrugged. "Then just help him." "It's not that simple," she said. "I signed an agreement with the company. If I don't follow it—" She trailed off. He gave her a look, the same one his grandfather used to give when he thought she was overthinking something. "Grandpa always helped people. You tell me all the time." Her throat tightened. The next afternoon, she found Ronnie outside near the parking lot. He was sitting cross-legged on the pavement, holding a wrench while Flynn guided him through removing a rusted chain from the motorcycle. "Loosen it slow," Flynn said, his voice patient. "Let the tool do the work." Ronnie grinned. "You worked on bikes in the army?" "Mostly trucks. Humvees. Anything that had wheels and broke down in the desert," Flynn replied. "What was it like?" Flynn's hands paused for a moment, his eyes flicking toward the distance as if measuring how much of the past to share. "Hot, loud, sometimes too quiet." He didn't elaborate, but Ronnie didn't push. Sarah stood a few steps back, watching the easy rhythm between them. Her son hadn't shown this much interest in anything all summer. When Flynn glanced up and caught her eye, she managed a small smile. He gave a brief nod in return, not of gratitude exactly, but of mutual understanding. That evening, she sat back at the kitchen table, staring at the eviction notice template she was supposed to fill out and send. The weight of her father's voice lingered in her mind. Keep them housed, Sarah. If you can help someone stay on their feet, you do it. No matter what. With a slow breath, she crumpled the notice and tossed it into the trash. Flynn would have another month, and she would find a way, somehow, to protect both him and the last piece of her family's home. The knock came just after 8 a.m. 3 brisk raps that carried an unmistakable air of authority. Sarah opened the lobby door to find a tall man in a charcoal gray suit, his black leather briefcase tucked neatly under one arm. His hair was steel gray, combed with military precision, and his expression held no trace of warmth. "Ms. McKinley?" he asked, flashing a laminated ID. "Mark Halpern, Regional Compliance Inspector." "Yes. Can I help you?" "I'm here on behalf of Horizon Property Management," he said, stepping inside before she could answer. "Today's inspection is unannounced, as per Clause 5.3 of your management contract." Sarah bit the inside of her cheek. "Of course." Halpern opened his briefcase and pulled out a thick clipboard. "Let's begin." The next 45 minutes felt like walking through a courtroom with no chance to speak in her own defense. Halpern moved briskly from one floor to the next, noting everything in clipped, technical phrases. Peeling paint in stairwell, safety hazard. Loose railing on third-floor landing, immediate repair required. Improperly stored bicycles in basement, violation. At each note, his pen scratched the paper with finality, as if the verdict had already been decided. When they reached the second-floor hallway, Flynn stepped out of his apartment carrying a small toolbox. He nodded politely to Sarah but didn't linger. Halpern's eyes followed him down the hall. Unit 2B, 63 days late on rent. His tone was flat, but the implication was sharp. "You're aware of the requirement for eviction?" Sarah felt her jaw tighten. "I'm aware of the policy." He made another mark on his clipboard. "Policies are in place for a reason, Ms. McKinley. Sentiment doesn't keep a building solvent." By the time Halpern left, she had a written notice listing 12 violations and a warning. Fines would begin accruing in 10 days if the issues weren't addressed, and if the delinquent tenant situation wasn't resolved. At noon, her phone buzzed with a call from the bank. She recognized the number instantly. "Ms. McKinley, this is Carla from Franklin State Bank. I'm calling regarding your first loan payment. It's now 15 days overdue." Sarah pressed the bridge of her nose. "I know. I'm working on it. I understand, but our records indicate no payment arrangements have been made. If you're unable to submit the full amount within the next week, we'll have to explore alternative resolutions." She didn't have to ask what alternative resolutions meant. She'd heard it before. Foreclosure, repossession, the building stripped from her hands like a photo torn out of an album. When she hung up, she sat in silence, listening to the faint hum of the old lobby lights. Her father had fought to keep this place afloat through recessions, floods, even a boiler explosion in '98. And here she was, one missed payment away from losing it. That afternoon, Ronnie wandered into the kitchen, tossing an apple from hand to hand. "You look mad," he said. "I'm fine. You're gripping that mug so hard, you're gonna break it." Sarah glanced down. He was right. She set it on the counter and exhaled slowly. The inspector came by. "The bank called. It's a lot." Ronnie leaned against the counter. "I was with Flynn earlier. He told me about his friend, Matt. Said they were stationed together overseas, same Humvee unit. One day, a roadside bomb hit the convoy. Flynn was in the vehicle ahead. Matt." He trailed off, shrugging, but his eyes held the heaviness of the story. Sarah felt a tug in her chest. "I'm sorry you had to hear that." "I'm not. I get why you're helping him. He's not just some guy who won't pay his rent. He's been through stuff I can't even imagine. People talk, you know. Some say you're risking everything for one tenant. I tell them they don't know him. His voice carried a quiet defiance she recognized, the same stubborn streak his grandfather had. Over the next few days, Sarah juggled her reality like a circus act with no safety net. She drafted repair estimates she couldn't afford, called contractors who either laughed at her budget or didn't return her calls, and tried to calculate which bills could wait another week without shutting off the lights. One evening, as she was sorting mail in the lobby, Flynn came in with a small grocery bag. His limp was a little worse than usual, and his shirt sleeves were smudged with something dark. He gave her a polite nod, but there was a flicker in his eyes, exhaustion, maybe pain. She almost asked if he was all right, but stopped herself. Flynn didn't volunteer much, and pushing him would only make him retreat. Instead, she said, "Motorcycle running any better?" He gave the faintest smile. "Getting there." That night, long after Ronnie had gone to bed, Sarah sat at the kitchen table with the bank's letter spread open in front of her. The red-circled balance seemed to burn through the paper. Beside it, her laptop screen glowed, the eviction form ready to be filled in, Flynn's name waiting in the blank fields. She leaned back, staring at the ceiling, feeling the weight of the day pressing in from all sides. It wasn't just about numbers anymore. It wasn't even about contracts. It was about what kind of person she'd be if she traded her conscience for compliance. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, then pulled back. She closed the laptop, slid the bank letter into a drawer, and let out a slow, unsteady breath. Some choices, she thought, define you long after the debt is paid. And she wasn't about to let this one define her the wrong way. Flynn Walker had never been comfortable accepting help. Back in the service, if you couldn't pull your own weight, you found a way to make up for it, no excuses. That belief had followed him home from the desert, even if his body didn't always keep up with his will. Which is why, after his brief exchange with Sarah in the lobby earlier that week, he decided he couldn't just sit and watch her take the heat for his debt. On Monday night, while most of the building slept, he walked down to the bus stop under a thin blanket of stars and caught a ride to the industrial park outside town. A friend at the trucking depot, a wiry man named Carl who owed him a favor from years back, had gotten him on the night shift loading pallets. The pay wasn't great, but it was cash and it was something. The work was punishing. Flynn's limp worsened after hours of pushing freight jacks across the cold concrete floor. Still, he kept going, muttering to himself that a man could endure anything for the right reason. By Thursday, he'd added a second shift at a warehouse across the highway, stacking boxes, sorting shipments, jobs the younger guys moved through with ease. Flynn paced himself, careful not to push too far. But no matter how cautious he tried to be, strain had a way of finding the cracks in old bones. That weekend, as he returned from the corner store, he spotted Mrs. Lasky, the elderly widow in 2C, wrestling with a tower of boxes on the first-floor landing. "Let me get those for you," he said, setting down his own work backpack. "Oh, Flynn, you don't have to. I insist." The boxes were heavier than he expected, full of donated clothes for the church drive. By the second flight, his back began to throb. By the third, it was a searing line of fire up his spine. Still, he forced a steady face until the last box was inside her apartment. "Bless you, dear," she said, patting his arm. Flynn managed a smile, but once he was in the hallway, he gripped the railing and took the steps down slowly, his pride stinging worse than the pain. Later that day, Ronnie found him in the parking lot, half bent over the motorcycle, trying to disguise the stiffness in his movements. "You hurt your back," Ronnie said flatly. "I'm fine. You're not. Mom says you've been working nights." "Why? You don't have to." "Yes, I do." Flynn cut in, his tone sharper than intended. He straightened slowly, leaning on the seat for balance. "I'm not here to be a burden. Your mom's done more for me than I deserve." Ronnie crossed his arms, frustration flickering in his eyes. "You deserve it because you're a good man. That should be enough." Flynn didn't answer. Instead, he looked down at the bike, his hands tightening on the worn grips, as if the machine could absorb everything he couldn't say out loud. When the pain became too much for another warehouse shift, Flynn started spending more time at the truck stop down the road, Red Line Junction, a squat brick building with a flickering neon sign. It was owned by Harry Leroy, an old friend from his platoon days who'd lost 2 fingers in the same blast that left Flynn with his limp. "Just pour coffee and wipe counters," Harry told him. "No heavy lifting. And don't argue." The stop was a haven for drivers rolling in from the interstate, a place where the air was always thick with diesel. The coffee was strong enough to jolt you awake, and the radio in the corner was always on the rock station. Flynn worked quietly behind the counter, refilling mugs, swapping out the occasional filter in the trucker showers. He didn't talk much about himself, but the regulars noticed the way he favored his left leg, the careful way he bent to pick up anything heavier than a sugar jar. They didn't pry, but the questions started in side conversations at the corner booths. "You see Walker limping worse lately?" "Yeah, he's keeping something close to the vest. Good man, though. Stood up for me once at a way station years back." By the end of the week, word had quietly spread across the CB channels and diner counters of the local trucking community. Flynn Walker was in a tough spot. That Friday night, Sarah sat at her kitchen table, staring at the latest letter from the bank. The red ink figure glared back at her like an accusation. She rubbed her temples, feeling the weight of every decision she'd made since signing the management contract. Across town, Flynn stood in the truck stop's back office with the door closed. He'd been staring at the phone for 5 minutes before finally picking it up. The number he dialed was one he hadn't called in years. It rang twice before a familiar voice answered. "Walker." "Yeah," Flynn said, his voice low and steady. "I need a favor." There was a pause on the other end, not of hesitation but of understanding. "You just say where and when." Flynn closed his eyes briefly, the tension in his shoulders easing just enough to take the next breath. This wasn't about pride anymore. It was about honor and making sure Sarah McKinley didn't pay the price for his battles. The sound woke Sarah before her alarm. It wasn't the usual city hum or the occasional rumble of a garbage truck. This was different. A deep, steady chorus of diesel engines idling in unison. She pulled back the curtain and froze. Lined along the curb, stretching past the corner, were trucks. Big rigs in gleaming chrome, weathered pickups with dented doors, and a few box trucks with company logos faded by sun and rain. Some bore military decals. Others had small American flags mounted near the mirrors. And in front of them, a dozen men and women stood shoulder to shoulder in the early light, their worn military jackets catching the first gold of the morning sun. Sarah slipped on her coat and hurried downstairs, her heart pounding. Flynn was already there in the parking lot, standing a few steps ahead of her, his hands buried in his jacket pockets. He looked tired, but there was a steadiness in his eyes she hadn't seen before. The group broke into quiet smiles when they saw him. "Walker," a broad-shouldered man with a close-cropped beard said, stepping forward. "You call, we come. Always." Flynn's mouth quirked into the faintest smile. "Didn't expect the whole crew." "You know better than that," said a woman in her 50s, her hair tied back in a bandana. "We heard what's going on, and some of us heard it twice." She shot a knowing glance toward one of the pickup drivers, who shrugged. "Word gets around at the truck stops." Sarah blinked. So that's what the whispers in the community had been leading to. The bearded man turned to her. "Ma'am, you're the one keeping our brother from sleeping under a bridge. That makes you family." Before she could respond, he held out a thick envelope. "This covers what he owes. And the next month, too. But we're not just dropping off cash." One by one, the veterans went to the beds of their trucks and started unloading. Toolboxes, buckets of paint, replacement wood planks, even a set of industrial ladders. The air filled with the metallic clink of wrenches, the rip of duct tape, and the scrape of metal on pavement. "Where do you want us to start?" someone called out. Sarah found her voice. You don't have to." "We know," the woman in the bandana said. "We want to." Within minutes, the building came alive with purposeful noise. 2 of the men began sanding down the peeling paint on the front stair railings. A pair of women carried lumber to replace the cracked steps out back. Someone else was already recaulking the leaky lobby windows. Ronnie darted between them, eager to help, holding boards steady while they were cut and handing out cold bottles of water from the vending machine. His grin was the widest Sarah had seen in months. Inside, the smell of fresh paint mingled with the faint scent of brewed coffee drifting from a thermos one of the vets had brought. Neighbors peeked from doorways, curious at first, then coming down to offer thanks or carry supplies. The energy was contagious. Sarah stepped back for a moment, leaning against the wall to take it in. She thought about the inspector's cold checklist, the bank's thinly veiled threats, the eviction notice she'd refused to sign. This sense of people showing up, unasked and unwavering, was what her father had meant when he said the building was a promise. By mid-morning, word had spread beyond the block. A few curious neighbors showed up, and even brought reporters, snapping photos of the work crews and interviewing residents. A story began to take shape. A landlord defying corporate orders to protect a veteran, and a platoon repaying that kindness with action. When Halpern, the property inspector, arrived just before noon, his expression flickered from confusion to irritation to something more cautious. He stepped out of his car, adjusting his tie as he surveyed the scene. "Ms. McKinley, Morning, Mark," Sarah said evenly. "You're just in time to see the repairs being handled properly." Halpern glanced around, at the freshly painted railing, the new stair boards being secured, the lobby windows free of drafts, and said nothing. The cameras from the reporters didn't miss a beat, clicking as he stood there. "I'll make note of the progress," he finally said, retreating toward his car without another word. By early afternoon, the last screws were tightened, the final brushstrokes of paint smoothed into place. The veterans gathered in the parking lot, some leaning on their trucks, others stretching sore backs. The bearded man clapped Flynn on the shoulder. "You're good now, brother. And don't make us wait this long for a reunion next time." Flynn's voice was low but certain. "You all saved more than just me today." He glanced toward Sarah, then to Ronnie, who stood grinning beside him. One by one, the trucks pulled away, their engines fading into the distance until only the quiet of a warm afternoon remained. That evening, Sarah sat at her kitchen table again. But this time, the space around her felt lighter. The bank still wanted its payment. The management company would still send its letters. But she knew now she wasn't alone in the fight. Ronnie leaned in the doorway. "So, Flynn's gonna teach me how to ride that motorcycle when it's fixed." Sarah smiled. "Only if you promise to wear a helmet." In the apartment across the hall, Flynn unpacked a small bag from the truck stop, the faint smell of coffee and diesel still clinging to the fabric. He ran a hand over the repaired stair railing outside his door. Sometimes he thought the right call was the one you made without knowing how it would end, because some debts of honor could only be paid by showing up. This story reminds us that a single act of compassion can ripple further than we'll ever see. What would you have done in Sarah's place? Follow the rules or take the risk? Share your thoughts below. And if this story moved you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to embrace the journey for more stories like this. See you in the next video.